Hi, welcome to North of 48. This is part two of In the Middle of Ukraine with journalist Philip Eitner. Professor Ann Lee continues the discussion.
I wanted to get your sense of what the post-war, because there will be a post-war Ukraine, that
Yes.
ultimately Ukraine is going to have to be one of the most well-armed nations in on the continent, simply because of this war. And I wanted to get your sense of how you see that happening, because just the fact that the U.S. is sending things, but it's pretty clear that from a sort of war Keynesian military Keynesianism, that there's going to have to be a huge standing army in Ukraine.
Yeah, most likely that's right. It depends on what happens in Russia, of course, to a certain degree. But because I think there's the very distinct possibility that Russia, when it loses this war, which it will do, one way or the other, it's going to lose this war. And it's going to have to look in the mirror and do some really hard assessing of its sense of identity, which has been a long time coming. You could argue, obviously, 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, but you could go back, deeper into Russia's history. And they're going to have to reassess who they are. They're going to have to do the hard work, Russians are, of looking in the mirror and reassessing who they are. And that's going to be a difficult thing. But Ukrainian sovereignty and its place in the world and its place on the European continent, I think it's a really interesting topic of discussion, because I'm not I don't give a pass to the European powers. I think there have been elements within Europe that have been deathly afraid of a sovereign Ukraine. This has always been, as I talked about, empire. This has always been a territory that has actually been up for grabs. And so a lot of powers, I mean, when Hitler spoke about Lebensraum in the Second World War, he wasn't talking about the middle of nowhere in Siberia. Nobody wanted to conquer the taiga. This is what they wanted. Ukraine is what the Nazis wanted. This was the Lebensraum. And there's a legacy of that from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the Germans to the Turks. Lots of people have coveted Ukraine, and it's been this moving thing that people, and this will now finally finish that question, and it's going to be massive in its historical impact, because it will once and for all establish a sovereign free country, an enormous country, by the way. You look at the size of Ukraine in European standards. Mm-hmm. And I think there are elements within, I think it's one of the, I can't point to anything specifically, but I think it's one of the reasons why the Europeans, the Germans in particular, have been so reluctant in their support of Ukraine. It's because, we talk about Russian dominance over Ukraine. Western European powers have tried to exert their dominance over Ukraine for centuries as well. So, I think there was a reluctance on the part of Germany, because Europeans understand that if Ukraine does get sovereignty and self-determination and codified borders, there's a very strong chance that the power balance within Europe may very well shift from a Franco-German dominance in the European Union to a Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian dominance. There's so much wealth in Ukraine. There is agriculture. There is military industrial. Even before this war, and even before Western powers, flooded this place with weaponry, there was an enormous military industrial complex. There's international, there's intellectual property. This is a highly educated population, and just by sheer size on the European continent, this is going to change Europe. Yes. There will, the Ukrainians are going to exert their influence, and I think many Europeans are concerned about that. When Ukraine is sovereign and this war is ended, they're going to be a powerhouse, an
Yep.
absolute powerhouse on the on the European continent. And I think the Germans are really afraid of it. The French to a certain extent, and then the Brits. The Brits like to be spoilers, of course, on the continent. They have a history of,
Well, they made
kind of
they made some moves about sort of allying through Poland to Ukraine, and that's I think an
100%.
interesting development.
Yeah, no, 100%. And then the Poles have a long history with Ukraine. I mean, Western Ukraine was Poland for many years, and there was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And anyhow, I look. What it really comes down to is that this is a massively historically important war, and it's going to change Europe. And now, how does Russia respond once it loses? That's also going to be hugely significant. I mean, one can argue that Russia has been for centuries unmanageable because it's Catherine the Great in the 18th century expanded rapidly and arguably too rapid, and they're going to have to deal with not being an empire anymore, and that's going to be the shockwave from the Russian defeat in Ukraine is going to be arguably a bigger crisis, I believe, a bigger crisis than the actual war itself, because to my mind, it's a done deal. Ukraine has won this war. It's just a matter of what Ukraine looks like in a post-war situation. So it's enormous. The historical implications of this war are hugely significant. And, America is Canada, America, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They're going to have to adapt to what happens in a post-war Ukraine. But make no doubt about it, this country is going to be sovereign. And if we remove our support for them, they won't stop fighting it. We'll have to sit back and watch as Ukrainians will continue to fight, and it will be ugly. But they're just not going to. I equate it to an abusive marriage where the abused spouse has already decided, right, my bags are packed. I've tried to leave a couple of times in the past, and I've always been, refused. But the abuser spouse in the form of Russia has been saying, how dare you leave me? I'm going to beat you into loving me again. And it's, as those of us who have been eyewitness or have been involved in an abusive relationship know, there's a point where the die is cast, and the die has been cast here. They're never going to be connected to Russia again, ever. And, with or without our support. So.
Can I just interject? You guys brought up Poland and Ukraine, and there was a lot of animosity after the Second World War because some of the Ukrainians were with the Nazis, and then they went over to the Soviets. And my point is, nowadays, Poland is Ukraine's best friend. Is the synergy between them? I think Poland recognizes how if Ukraine falls, Poland could be next. And the Baltic countries, there's a reason why they chose NATO, is because they're scared of going back into the Soviet system. So I just wanted to reiterate that. And do you have another question before we go to questions?
No, I don't. And I really do want to thank Philip, because so much information that we're getting has so much filtration, and I really appreciate your.
I really thank you, Ann. I want to touch on that, and
Sure.
Walter, it's really important to understand this, because Moscow will tell you that NATO expanded, and that they are scared of NATO on their border. What happened was NATO didn't expand. The countries that had been living under the thumb of the Kremlin came running to embrace the West. They fled Russia. Again, it's the abusive relationship that Moscow cannot recognize that they are an abuser. I go back to the abusive marriage analogy yet again. They were abused by Moscow. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, they ran as quickly as they could away from Moscow. They weren't seduced by the West. They fled an abuser in Moscow. That's what Georgians did. That's what the Baltics did. That's what we even see in Central Asian countries now. Now, they might be looking at a relationship with China, but in essence, what they're running away from is Moscow, because Moscow has a vertical power structure. Everything flows to Moscow. Is an abuser, and they don't even recognize it. They don't even acknowledge it. Oh, yeah, we were all in the Soviet Union together, and everybody loved us. No, Russia and Moscow in particular were, abusing it. They were, taking everything that they could, because that's the vertical power structure that exists in Russia. And I could say the same thing about, Irkutsk or Yekaterinburg or Vladivostok or Rostov, as I would say about Kiev or Tbilisi. Everything gets sucked up into the power of Moscow, and that's how they exist, because Russian power structures is a binary. It's a null. It's a win or lose. It's all nulls and ones. So Ukraine said enough. I don't want to be part of that. Georgia has said enough. I don't want to be part of that. Uzbekistan, take your pick. The Baltic states. And the Russians can't get it through their head. Moscow can't get it through its head that we're not seducing these guys away. They're running away from you because you're abusive, and it's a cruel, power structure. It's a power dynamic that people don't want to live in.
Well, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Go right. I could touch on the whole Second World War and
right. Yeah.
Nazism in Ukraine. And
I would
Bandera.
love to do a 10-hour podcast with you, my friend.
Yeah, we could easily.
Yeah.
Easily could. I will make the one quick point about that whole period with Stepan Bandera. I want to make two quick points about Bandera, if I may.
Okay, sure.
Because Bandera is this big boogeyman. One cannot look at the Second World War and Ukrainian complicity with Nazi Germany without understanding that the Holodomor, which was created by the Soviet Union, one way or the other, and we could go into it, but I don't want to go into the final, the finite details about what happened to the Holodomor, a forced famine which killed, by estimates, somewhere between 7 and 10 million people.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody had a family member that was starved to death by an institutionalized policy from Moscow, from Stalin. You get your head around that. The idea that if you didn't lose a family member, you knew somebody whose family had lost somebody by starvation. Mm-hmm. in the 20th century, and that motivated a lot of people, aside from the centuries of abuse from Moscow. But then secondly, to understand the history of that period, is to also recognize that Victor gets to write the history, and I am not a fan of Stepan Bandera. The things that we know that he definitively did were violent and were counterproductive, in my opinion, which is why he was expelled from the Ukrainian Nationalist Party. Mm-hmm. Again, nationalist in terms of I want to have a nation state,
and that's
Ukraine.
Something nobody says that he was.
Nobody
expelled.
talks about this.
That's right.
He was expelled from the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalism. That's why the OUNB was adopted. Nobody talks about the fact that two of his brothers were killed in Auschwitz. Nobody talks about the fact that he was detained by the Germans and held in house arrest in Berlin. I am not, again, I want to make it 100% clear, not a Bandera fan. I know a lot of Ukrainians who are, have the same opinion, but Bandera's history has been manipulated by the Russians for 70 years. I mean, if the Sons of Liberty in the United States in the colonial war of revolution, the Revolutionary War, had Samuel Adams, for example, been defeated, if the Sons of Liberty had been defeated, do you really think that the narrative would be that George Washington was a great guy? No, the British would have spun a different narrative, just like the Russians have spun a different narrative about all the guys who have fought, most notably Bandera, but many others, against Russian oppression. So of course they're gonna manipulate the story about Bandera and turn him into this great big boogeyman. Not that he was the great guy. So and I even know Ukrainians who hate Bandera, but who will wear Bandera T-shirts because it's a symbol of how their history has been manipulated. It's not Bandera himself; it's the iconography of Bandera as a symbol of a history that has been stolen from them because Moscow has written the Ukrainian story, and so they will say, I don't know Bandera's story, but what I do know is that Bandera's story has been manipulated by Moscow. And that's why I wear a Bandera t-shirt or have a Bandera poster in my house, stuff like that. The legacy of Russia's abuse of this country cannot be ignored when it comes to the decisions either in 1919, 1936, or 1942, or now here in the 2000s. Russia can't wrap its head around the idea that they're just not that into you. They want to leave.
I was going to mention two things. Was from the Russians I talked to. They say that St. Petersburg and Moscow are the king of Russia, and everybody else in the territories are just taxpayers.
Yeah.
So, and the second thing is Gorbachev concerning NATO said there was no agreement for NATO to encroach, and people don't say anything about that as well. So we have some questions from the audience. I have one from Lynn, and then we'll go to Rodrigo, if you don't mind, Philip. And Anne, you're good? She is. I guess she's got her mic muted. So Anne's question is, can our guest discuss the military preparations for a spring offensive by Ukrainian forces and the extent to which they are sufficiently armed by the U.S. and NATO to assess whether they will achieve some sort of decisive victory or a knockout blow in a war that is predicted to last another 2 to 3 years. So in a sense, I guess if you break it down, do they have enough military equipment coming in? Are they prepared? Do you think they're capable right now to push the Russians out? And let me just paraphrase, like, even everybody thinks there's a spring offensive coming. That doesn't mean if they don't succeed totally into Crimea that this is the end of the war. I mean, these things could go on for a couple of years before they succeed. So I understand that. But
yeah, I mean, short of a lot of weaponry operation, they're they're always going to want more.
Yes.
But they have been flooded with arms. They've been flooded with training, and they're going to fight in a very different way than Russian military doctrine is structured. And I'm cautiously optimistic that it will be effective because it's a far better fighting doctrine than what the Russian doctrine is. Basically, artillery and masses of conscripts. By and large, that's how they fought for centuries. And if you look at their own doctrine, they openly say artillery is the god of war. Whereas what the Ukrainians are doing, because of the weaponry that they've been given, but also because of their desire, their acknowledgement that they have a less, they have less people, and so they want to keep their people alive. That's a bigger concern, because you also want to have, people who are trained in warfare, who are veterans, who have been through combat before. You want those people to survive because they're better on the battlefield. But I mean, there's a massive amount of weaponry that's been flooded into the place, and also contributing to this is, I talk about the Ukrainian desire to have, experienced fighters. Well, since 2014, they have rotated units through Donbass, so that every Ukrainian soldier has experienced combat, and that was on purpose because they knew this greater war was coming. So they wanted to make sure that every Ukrainian had been in combat, so they weren't freaked out by it, and they were able to, fight. The spring offensive. It's tricky. Spring offensive is going to be tricky because they've got to get it right. The worst thing that could happen is that they launch an offensive that is defeated, because the Western powers are going to go, well, why are we supporting you? And they know that, so they want to get everything sorted out so that whatever they do, it's going to be effective. It doesn't have to be. They're going to want to take as much as they possibly can. They're going to want to try and take back Crimea. They're going to want to take back all of the Donbass, and if they can achieve that, then they'll go for it. But what's worse would be to try and take back territory and then be rebuffed, to be defeated, because then the West is going to be like, well, what are we signing up for here? They're trained. I've seen Ukrainian forces using something that NATO calls combined arms doctrine, which is basically the idea that you conduct combat operations with air power, artillery, armor, infantry, all, information, surveillance, all that combined into military doctrine. The Russians aren't nearly as sophisticated with that, and I'm comfortable with saying that. If you want to argue with me, I can, but they're using their forces in Ukraine smarter than the way the Russians use their armed forces. So we'll see how much they can reclaim. I'm cautiously optimistic that it's going to be a successful campaign, and at the very least that they will drive to the sea and split Russian forces in half. Maybe Mariupol is regained or something like that.
Right.
But and I should also mention at this point that much of this war is about Sevastopol. It's not even about Crimea. It's about, a fourth of Russia's naval power is located in Sevastopol and Crimea. And so as a domino effect, you have to, in order to sustain Sevastopol, you have to have Crimea. In order to have Crimea, you have to have a land bridge because the Kerch bridge is insufficient.
Right.
And so all these domino effects to a larger tactical, strategic situation for Russia, so integral to the naval base of Sevastopol, is intrinsic, is a major part of why this war is happening. And if they lose their land bridge and can no longer support their naval base, then why are they fighting a war in Ukraine? We could go into greater depth into that, but
right. Well, we have other questions. So
I think in short, I think the Ukrainians are about to give a whooping to the Russians, and we'll see.
Fair enough. We can hope. Rodrigo, you have a question, my friend?
Yes.
Rodrigo's from Mexico. I'll just point that out.
Hola.
Hola. I'm very frustrated by my inability to find a single piece of analysis that isn't tainted either by the Putin did nothing wrong side or the if there were Nazis in Ukraine, they're all dead side. But speaking of Putin, I keep hearing from my anti-tanky friends that the Wagner group is threatening to take the mercenaries and go home if Putin doesn't listen to him. Maybe Philip or Ann Lee can explain that situation.
Yeah, Prigozhin. Prigozhin is an interesting case in this entire story, and what I think we're seeing internally within Russia is something that is historically Russian, and that is that the czar, in this case Putin, always has to be on an elevated plane. So when the war is not going the way they want it to, there's a secondary line of the you know the boyars, the aristocracy control above the czar. They're now going to fight amongst themselves so that somebody can be scapegoated, and I think that's what we're seeing now. Because of course the czar can't be at fault. It's obviously somebody let him down. Somebody let us down. So I think a lot of that is what's happening with Prigozhin right now, and he's maneuvering. He's maneuvering to, either get out of, say, Bakhmut, and then when things go badly, he can say, "Oh, wasn't us? It was Shoigu or Gerasimov, and they're the ones that failed us all." Because it can't be Putin, obviously.
Well, he's threatening to move his forces out because he doesn't have
He's
enough
threatening to move.
ammunition.
He just made an announcement yesterday. He was going to pull out on the 10th, which is of course historically important because it's the day after the 9th. He's not going to withdraw his forces in the run up to Victory Day, which is surpassed history in Russia. It's now achieved the point of religion, their legacy in the Second World War.
Okay.
So Prigozhin is increasingly one of these militant groups. It's like Kadyrov and the Chechens, like certain military groups internally within Russia. They are all vying for either an ability to remove themselves from responsibility for the catastrophe that everybody sees this war is going to become, or to get supremacy over another group who they then can blame. So a lot of that is going on and plays into what I have been just talking about, where I think the crisis. This is not the crisis. The Ukraine war, as awful as it is, it's not the crisis. The crisis is going to be when Russia loses this war and has to readdress who it is, look in the mirror and assess who it is, if it is not empire. And key to this sense of identity as empire is Ukraine. So there's going to be an internal battle within Russia. And I think Prigozhin is one of the most striking instances of that struggle internally within Russia.
Okay. Well, thanks, Philip. Rodrigo, are you satisfied with that answer? Or probably not.
Thank you.
So we have one from Joe in Norway. We now know that the U.S. war on Iraq was a nuclear war due to the use of depleted uranium. Do you know if there's evidence of depleted uranium in use due to the nature of warfare in Ukraine? Can you speak to the environmental impact of the fighting? And I'll come back to you, Anne.
I mean, we know that the British have pledged to send depleted uranium rounds to Ukraine. So there will be depleted uranium rounds being used in Ukraine, most likely. I mean, that's up to the Ukrainians. They'll be given the rounds by the Brits, if not the Americans. There's been no official announcement from the Americans, to my knowledge, that they're sending depleted uranium rounds, but there will be here. And that's up to the Ukrainians how to use it. And look, depleted uranium is a very controversial issue. I covered the Iraq War. I was down in Basra, where a lot of the hospitals were reporting an increase in child cancers and all sorts of things.
Well, they're out cleaning the mines right now too. The farmers are trying to plant and they have minesweepers going.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and then
that's all.
there's Chernobyl, there's the Zaporizhia power plant. There's reports in the last 36, 48 hours
Right.
out of the IAEA that the fourth reactor has been lined with explosives by Russian forces
Right. Yes.
in Zaporizhia. Which is that's a dirty bomb. That's in essence a dirty bomb.
100%.
So, it's to say it's not on people's minds would be, would be lying. But again, at the end of the day, the Ukrainians are just determined to have their sovereignty, and nobody wants one of the Zaporizhia reactors to explode. But
Oh no.
that'll be on Russia. That'll be on Russia.
Right. No, that's very true. Sorry, I just lost my question here. We got one from Joe in Norway. We now know that, no, sorry, I said that already. It's from Lynn. She wants to know what kind of, actually, we'll come back to that. I think somebody's unmuted there. Could you mute, please? We'll go to Henchman because he's got his hand up and he's live. So hi, Henchman, you got a question.
How's it going? Yeah, I just had one question. Given Putin / Russia's historical pattern, the first and second Chechen wars, Georgia in 2008, Crimea, and the sanctions in 2014, the fact that Moldova, etc., have less than a serious military, do you think that Putin will stop if the U.S. pushes appeasement of the annexation of the Donbass?
The annexation of the Donbass. I
Good
mean,
question.
if the Western powers push for that, there potentially a break with Kiev and Brussels or Washington. The problem with leaving Donbass in the hands of the Russians, or Crimea for that matter, in the hands of the Russians, is it's always going to position the Russians to want to take more. Ultimately, they're going, if they hold territory in that stretch of Ukraine and deny the 1991 borders, the Russians will always want more because as I addressed in what I said about Sevastopol and the naval base there. It's a domino effect. In order to keep Sevastopol, you need Crimea. In order to keep Crimea, you need the land bridge. Well, you could argue in order to keep the land bridge, you also have to control Kiev. In order to control the Black Sea, you have to push to Moldova. These arguments can be made if you're looking at it through a Russian lens. I do not think that the Russians are going. Well, I don't just think. I'm convinced that the Russians are not going to be able to connect it to their base in Transnistria in Moldova. Not going to happen. They would have to circumvent Odessa, which is a fortress city. I've been to Odessa a couple of times in this war. It's a fortress. It would be a bloody, bloody fight, and they can't just maneuver around it and then go on to Transnistria. So I don't see them connecting to Transnistria. As far as holding on to their gains in Donbass, and in Crimea, obviously, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to let them do that if they can, because as I say, if you let them control that, they're always going to want more. So you need to push them back to 90. There's a widespread feeling here. You need to push it back to 91 borders, no more, no less, and then solidify that border. Stay militarized. You're going to have to stay militarized if you're Ukraine. If Russia continues to exist in its current form, because they know their enemy. They know the Russians, and the Russians aren't going to ever give up if they have a chance to expand. So they have to be pushed back, and there's a big question about Donbass. I mean, Donbass is tricky because Donbass doesn't even actually want to be controlled by Moscow either. There's there's a whole movement in Donbass about Donbass, as a kind of unique place that doesn't align itself with either Moscow or Kiev. And that's a huge movement inside Donbass. And especially also because Donbass has now been used by Moscow as cannon fodder. And they don't, if Moscow really cared about Donbass for Donbass, it would have been, more considerate of actually the militaries that were there fighting alongside the Russians. Instead, what Moscow did was, just kind of throw them into the front lines. And there's a lot of resentment about that.
You get that?
So, anyhow.
All right, that's the end of part 2. Please look forward to part 3, which will be posted shortly. I'm going to apologize for some of the noise interruptions. There was an unmuted mic, plus we had a bad internet connection at times. But just a fascinating interview, and many thanks to Philip Eitner. Stay tuned for part 3.